Yes.
Andrew, if we can start this session with your evidence. You are a chartered chemical engineer. And before you started work, after university in 1986, you went on a long holiday in Norway.
Yeah, I graduated in 1986 as a chemical engineer. I'd had a chemical engineering scholarship from ICI. That meant I worked through university as well as studied. So I was looking forward to having a break before I started work in September. So I had a lot of Norwegian friends, so I went to Norway.
But while you were there, you had a road traffic accident.
Yep, I discovered a very interesting tunnel up in the mountains near Bergen, which had no lights in it, and it turned right on entry, so I went straight into the wall.
And in terms of the injuries you sustained, can you tell us about those?
First point of contact was my head and face, and then my motorbike landed on my leg and crushed my right leg, so the estimate was I had something like 17 fractures below the knee. It was 2.5 hours to extract me from my hole in the ground, get me to Bergen, but the medical treatment in Bergen was fantastic. I had a major trauma unit, so there was everybody on hand when I arrived. They stabilised me. I had an operation that night.
And you had a tibial nail inserted.
Absolutely, yeah. Unusual procedure at the time, but I had so many fractures to my tibia that they put a titanium nail from my knee to my ankle and basically realigned all the fractures around it and then fixed it.
And you also had fractures in your foot and ankle, and they were secured with wires.
Yes.
And you were treated at Haukelandssykehus in Bergen, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
You were then transferred back to Liverpool.
Yeah, I was flown home. I had a night at home. GP came out to see me because the Norwegians just gave me 1 day's worth of drugs. Took one look at me and called an ambulance, and I went to Broad Green Hospital in Liverpool. Bit of a culture shock. First time I'd actually been on the receiving end in a UK hospital, and compared to Norway, it was, I'll call it second world, but certainly Norway was far more impressive as a place to be.
And when you were in Norway, you were given blood transfusions.
Yes.
In Norway.
Yes.
You were then in Broad Green Hospital and for a while, and then subsequently in November 1986 and December 1986, you had further surgery.
Yeah, they needed to remove the fixings through the tibial nail. I've no idea if I had a blood transfusion in the theatre. I can't remember having a blood transfusion when I was on the ward after I came out of theatre, but I was in a world of pain, so I wasn't really paying much attention to that.
And the two surgeries, the first one was to remove the wires in your foot and ankle, and then the December surgery was to remove the screws from the tibial nail.
Yeah.
And when you were there, do you recall if that was considered to be quite major surgery or whether it was relatively routine?
It wasn't, certainly wasn't routine. I was out they put me out. When I came to, I had a bruise from my shoulder to my groin because the Norwegians had told me that the screws needed to come out after 8 weeks, and it was 17 weeks. So they had quite a struggle. And they'd also opened up all the fractures in my tibia again. So I wasn't in great shape.
And then in October 1987, you were treated in Blackburn Royal Infirmary, and they removed the tibial nail at that point.
Yeah, I was getting a lot of pain in my knee, so walking was very, very painful because it was metal on bone. So it was agreed to take the nail out.
And do you know whether in that surgery you had a blood transfusion?
Definitely. I remember coming to and seeing the bags of blood hanging up around me.
And you were then readmitted 2 weeks later because of more complications.
My knee swelled up really, really badly. And I'd attended the fracture clinic. The solution seemed to be that the doctor got hold of my knee and pressed. So that burst all the stitches and emptied certainly effective in draining my knee, but it meant it was readmitted.
That was 1987.
Yep.
How did you then come to find out that you had hepatitis C?
I was working for ICI from In the mid-1990s, I started working on the more international side of the business, and I was working with ICI India to establish a business in India. So late 98, I was having a meeting in New Delhi, and I became quite ill. It was about a week before I was well enough to fly home. That sort of passed, but I felt ill. I never felt well again. My GP basically said, well, you've been in India, you've got something, it'll go. But the occupational health department in ICI wanted to know what I had. So they started a very extensive set of tests to establish what I might have had in India. After about 2 months, they said, we can't actually detect anything that you might have caught in India, but there doesn't seem to be something right with your liver. Give it another, I think it was another month, and they came back and said, here's a letter, go to see your GP, you've got hepatitis C.
So once you were diagnosed with hepatitis C, but effectively through the tests that the occupational health team had done, you were then referred to the Freeman's Hospital.
In Newcastle, yes.
And what were you told then about the availability of treatment?
Well, they reconfirmed the diagnosis by PCR, and they also did a liver biopsy. So the feedback from that was that I definitely had hepatitis C, that I had fibrosis to the liver. I asked them what the implications was for me, and they said, well, based on what we've seen, you've probably got 5 to 7 years to live. So obviously, next question is, what treatment are you going to give? And the answer was none. It's too expensive for the NHS. I asked them how much it cost, and they said about £20,000. So well, can I pay for it? No. So I was then in a dilemma. I couldn't get treatment through the NHS, and they wouldn't allow me treatment through any other route. So, presumably I just had to sit there and die. I had some conversations with my MP about it, but that didn't lead anywhere.
But then in 2000, you were able to join a trial of pegylated interferon and ribavirin.
Yeah, Professor Bassendine in Newcastle was aware of my persistence in looking for treatment, and made me aware that there was a trial coming up on peg interferon and ribavirin, and asked me if I was prepared to take part, which I was. I didn't fit the trial criteria because apparently male and over 40 wasn't a good, but I got into the trial, so I started in 2001.
And you had 48 weeks of treatment and managed to clear the virus?
Yes, yeah, I didn't, yeah. I was having, after 3 months I still hadn't cleared, so they threatened to withdraw treatment. Fortunately, after 4 months, 16 weeks, I had cleared, so I continued to the end.
Since that treatment, what's your health been like?
Yeah. Well, I've cleared the virus, but my immune system was quite comprehensively damaged, so I get infections regularly. Typically, a major infection every year, 2 or 3 small ones. So I've had sepsis 3 times. I've had pneumonia. Yeah, I'm a regular visitor to hospitals with infections.
You've also got raised blood pressure and heart rate.
That was interesting because all the way through treatment, they never once did OBS, standard OBS. So after I think it was 2 or 3 PCRs, I was discharged from Newcastle and picked up again by my GP. And the first thing he did was check my blood pressure, and it was very high. And my resting heart rate was over 100.
You were also diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in 2017.
Yep.
And you said you've had sepsis. It was biliary sepsis twice in 2013 and then again in 2016. Is that right? And in terms of your immune system, you went to see an immunologist about that.
Yes, I did.
And what were you told?
That basically there's 4 proteins which form the basis of your immune system, and 2 of them in my case were at very, very low levels. One of them's called C-reactive CRP, C-reactive protein, is what doctors use to establish whether you have an infection or not. And the immunologist told me that my base levels were so low that even if they went up 100-fold, I still wouldn't pass the test that a standard doctor would recognise that I had an infection. So I have a history of knowing I have an infection, but not getting a doctor to believe me that I have an infection. So usually I have to wait until I get seriously ill before they'll intervene.
And what's the impact been on your work with all of these health difficulties?
Well, what effectively it's done is since I had treatment, I've not been able to do a responsible role. So I've not been able to run a business. I've not been able to have a team of people. I've really not been able to manage a line budget. So effectively my career in the company came to an end when I had treatment. Because if you're having 6, 8, 10 weeks a year off sick, then you're not a reliable employee. So I'm more in a skilled, so I advise the company on things, but it means that I've just not been able to progress.
I think you've described that you're doing a sort of technical role, but you can't do any of the managerial or business development work that you were previously doing.
No.
In terms of the Skipton Fund, can you tell us how you came to hear about it?
Through the Hepatitis C Trust. One of the things that I did carry on after his discharge from Newcastle was that there's a charity called Liver News, which gives you booklets and informs you of what's going on at the Freemans. And one of the articles in there was around a survey that this Hepatitis C Trust was doing, so which I signed up for. It was looking for what was the ongoing effects of treatment. And in one of the articles in one of their magazines, it mentioned the Skipton Fund, which I'd never heard of. So I looked up more and then thought, well, I should have a go at this.
And with your application for the Skipton Fund, you provided a letter from Norway, which you'd obtained in 2001.
For the initial application, yeah. I was under the understanding that hepatitis C was something you had to register as a serious illness, that you can communicate it, therefore. So I asked at Freeman's, who had they told that I had hepatitis C, and they hadn't told anyone. So have you written to Norway? No. So I wrote to the Norwegians to say I'd been diagnosed with hep C, just to make them aware. And they responded with a letter that basically said, I'd received blood transfusions from 4 donors while I was in Norway, that 3 of those donors were still donors now and were testing negative, and that the 4th donor, they were looking to trace.
We'll look at, if you want, we'll look at the letter. Probably easier. WITN 0195005. Before we look at the terms of the letter, this only arose, though, Andrew, because you had contacted the Norwegians to tell them that you had hepatitis C. And we see their response. I'm sorry to hear that you've got the diagnosis hepatitis C. During your hospital stay in Bergen, you received blood from 4 donors. The Haukeland University Hospital Blood Bank started hepatitis C testing in October 1990. In 1986, the hepatitis C virus was unknown, and consequently there was not any test available. We have examined through our donor files. 3 of the 4 donors have tested anti-hepatitis C negative. The 4th donor has not given blood since 1987, and she's not tested hepatitis C positive as a patient. So you sent this letter with your application to the Skipton Fund, but your application was refused.
Yep.
And if we can turn to that, EIBS 400148, please, underscore 061. And we see a response, if we look down towards the middle of the page. The supporting medical information submitted in your application did not provide sufficient evidence that, on the balance of probabilities, you'd contracted hepatitis C through NHS blood or blood products. I understand from the documentation provided that you received blood transfusions from 4 donors in Norway, and that 3 of the 4 donors were anti-HCV negative, but the 4th cannot be ruled out as a potential source of infection. The medical assessors could find no record of your receipt of NHS blood or blood products in the documentation provided. You sought your records from Blackburn Hospital.
I did.
And what were you told about that?
I had a letter saying that in accordance with hospital policy, my records have been destroyed.
And in relation to Broad Green Hospital, what notes did you get from them?
They sent some records. I wouldn't describe them as comprehensive, but they had actually something on file. But it was quite difficult to really establish in detail what had happened.
And in those records, there wasn't any indication of a blood transfusion in those records?
No.
You also obtained a further letter from the Norwegian Hospital Trust.
Well, I got in touch with the Norwegians to tell them what EIBSS had said.
And we've got their response, the Norwegian response. WITN 0195 002, please. Dated April 2018. Is this the response that you got? It says, this is a response to your letter of March the 20th, 2018, concerning further information on the donor about whom we had no definite information about hepatitis C status in 2001. She's now been repeatedly, I think it should say tested, for antibodies to hepatitis C in relation to multiple hospital visits since 2005. All tests for anti-HCV have been negative. As mentioned in the letter from Prof Hervig in 2001, the other 3 donors of the 4 units of blood you received in 1986 were repeat donors beyond our testing for hepatitis C and testing negative. It is highly unlikely that you have contracted hepatitis C infection from the transfusions in 1986. So you provided that to EIBSS.
Yep.
And appealed their decision. And if we can just look at your appeal email, EIBS 40148_064, please. We can see there that you had provided the 3 responses, the Hawkerland Bergen response, the Royal Liverpool Hospital's response, and the East Lancashire Hospital response. And then you wrote this. It is very disappointing that East Lancashire Trust has destroyed my records because I had a significant operation to remove the tibial nail at Blackburn Royal Infirmary in 1987. This surgery was followed by readmission to deal with the complications which followed. A summary of my case for inclusion in the EIBSS scheme would be that 1. The Norwegian authorities have extensive records of my treatment and all blood donors involved, and they believe that it is highly unlikely that I could have contracted hepatitis C during their treatment. 2. I had 2 surgical procedures in Broad Green Hospital in Liverpool in 1986, for which some limited records are available and are attached. 3. I had 1 major surgical procedure in Blackburn Royal Infirmary in 1987, for which all records have been destroyed. I was admitted for surgery to remove the tibial nail from my right leg on 12th of October 1987 and had the operation the following day. The date is very clear to me because my stepfather had a heart attack at the hospital after dropping me at the ward. I was allowed out of bed for the first time to visit him on October the 23rd. He died that evening. I was readmitted to BRI a week later following complications with my right knee. Contracting hepatitis C has been a major event in my life, which has severely impacted on my health, quality of life and work prospects. I'm sure that this was contracted during one of the medical procedures I underwent during treatment within the UK. On this basis, I'm appealing your earlier decision. That appeal was unsuccessful. And we will just, if we may, turn to the rejection of the appeal. WITN 0195 006. There are the standard provisions, standard letter on the first page, but if we turn to page 2, and it's the 3rd paragraph. The panel noted that your appeal was based on a transfusion you received on returning home following a road traffic accident in 1986 in Norway. Unfortunately, due to the lack of supporting evidence, including medical records confirming that you were treated with NHS blood or blood products prior to 1991 in England, the panel were not satisfied that it was more probable than not that your hepatitis C infection resulted from qualifying NHS treatment. Accordingly, we regret that we must refuse your appeal. Andrew, were there any more records that you could have obtained?
Not that I was aware of. If there were, I would have pursued it if I thought I could find more evidence. I mean, it doesn't help that this system is quite diffuse. There is no clear pathway of how to obtain this evidence. So it's quite difficult and challenging to be outside of the system and then try and find it.
And I think that's something we'll come back to in our thematic conversation shortly. If we could then turn, Ruby, to talk to you a little bit about your situation. You're here to speak about your late sister, Anne, Ruby. She had a road traffic accident in 1982. Is that right?
Yes.
And she sustained some very serious injuries in that accident.
According to the record, I didn't know about it until I saw the record, and she did tell me that she had an accident, but she was not eager to sort of explain anything. She was still a bit sad about it, so she didn't, and I didn't press on it, but I knew she had an accident where she had a very terrible time in the hospital.
And in your statement, you've said that she had an operation to have her spleen removed and part of her stomach removed.
Yeah.
And your understanding is that she had multiple blood transfusions at that point in time.
At that time, yes.
And through them, she contracted hepatitis C.
Yes.
Anne also suffered renal failure and required a kidney transplant in 1989.
Yes.
And in 1999, Anne was told she'd contracted hepatitis C, but the family weren't aware of that at the time. Is that right?
No, we weren't aware of it. I just happened to saw when I was, after she died, and I was cleaning the house out, that I came across all the details of it.
In 2003, Anne developed rectal cancer as well.
Yeah.
She was also diabetic.
She was a diabetic. After the transplant, she got the sugar diabetes.
And in 2007, her transplanted kidney began to fail. Is that
It would
right?
be 2006. Yeah.
And then in February 2007, I think you received a telephone call from her neighbour.
Her neighbor, yeah.
And at that point, you were in Barbados.
I was in Barbados. I'm a missionary. I did missionary work there for the church.
And what was the situation with Anne? What had happened to her?
Well, the neighbor is who called me and told me that the taxi that takes her to the unit for the renal unit, and that the taxi man could not get into the house. So they called the neighbor, and the neighbor, of course, had the keys, and she went in, and her words were to me, they found her on the floor unconscious in a pool of blood. That was her word to me. And so she gave me the telephone number of the hospital. So I called the hospital today, and the nurse that was attending in ICU confirmed that, yes, Anne was unconscious at the time. So just during the time I was ringing, they never called me to find out what or give me any information, so I had no information.
Anne had septicemia, and then...
She had she contacted septicemia, and she also had stroke.
And she also had bleeding in the colon as well.
She was...
her colon, there was bleeding in her colon, in her lower intestine.
Serious bleeding in the colon, they said.
You got back to the UK in March, not very long after that, and you found Anne was really very unwell at that point.
Well, she was very unwell. I spent 3 days with her. On Monday, I got back from Barbados, the earliest flight I could get back. And I spent Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday in Norwich. And I told her I would come back because she was telling me about that they were going to do operation on her, and her words were they were going to bring part of her belly out on the top. And she said to me, I can never live with that. I could never live with that. No, I can. So anyhow, to start the story, I told her I would come back on the next week, the Monday, and see the doctor, because up till then I had no communication with the hospital, nothing. So I told her I would come back on the Monday and see her. And unfortunately, on the Monday, I came back on the coach again, and it was my daughter and my sister. And I got a telephone message to say that my Anne was taken to the operating theater the night, and that unfortunately, they couldn't stop the bleeding, and they let her go. She died. So we still carry on, the three of us, to the hospital. We got to the administrative office, and by the time we go into operation, the office saw the nurse sitting there, and she told me, she never even said, no sorry, nothing. She just said, give us the belongings to Anne, and she gave the certificate and whatever. I never even looked at it because the shock of it. But what she said is, then she told me that a message from the hospital chaplain to say, under no circumstances to see the body, to view the body. So we left the hospital, and the time came, and I went to register the death. I never even looked to see, and didn't even realize. I gave the round, they said Clark, the lady said Clark with the E, and to be quite honest, I think she wrote Clark without the E. Anyhow, and the time came for her to be buried, and I went then to the funeral director, and I took her best clothes because she was a model. She used to model these clothes and catwalk. She was very independent, and she was very outgoing, and so I took very nice dress and say, and then they told me, that, it was no use to bring that because under no circumstances, the hospital said to view the body.
Anne had undergone an operation to fit a colostomy bag.
Yeah.
So it was to have a
bag on the outside,
a stoma.
I didn't discuss it with her, but I was going back on the Monday to see after she told me, and she was so determined. She said, I will never have that. I'll never have that. No, I can't live with that. And I said I would go back on the Monday to see the doctor myself. And I didn't let her know that is what I was coming back to do, but unfortunately, we never got there. To die before.
Anne had applied to the Skipton Fund before she died. Yes,
she did. The consultant that looked after her in hospital, I saw the letters, and that's where I got the material from. No one told me anything. I just got from the notes that I saw in the house, and I saw he had written to Skipton Fund about Anne's condition and that she had contacted hepatitis C. But when she sent the form, Skipton Fund declined the form. And they didn't give I didn't see any reason for it, but I saw the flight declined. So when I saw all of this information that I got now with Skipton Fund within these notes that I saw, I called up Skipton Fund, and the guy said, He asked me first, who I was. I give him who I was, and I told him Anne had died. And he said to me then, oh, that's what she told when I told him that I saw his hepatitis C in the notes. He said, that's what she told you. I said, no, she never told me anything about it. But I got the record that you sent, and I got the information from you. That's how I come to contact you. So he sent me a form, and I had to go to the doctor, her GP, and the GP, I had to wait some time because they said they don't keep the record there, so they would send away for the records.
So you reapplied to the Skipton Fund in 2013,
yeah,
and provided letters from Anne's hepatologist and other medical letters that you'd managed to gather.
yeah.
And in 2014, the Skipton Fund accepted the application and paid a stage 1 payment.
No, first of all, they declined it, and I had to. They said if I did not agree with what they had said, I was to appeal. So I appealed, and it was accepted.
You then made an application for a stage 2 payment, but by then the clinician who had treated your sister had retired. Is that right? So the form was completed by a clinician on the basis of the records they had, but had never treated Anne.
No, that's what it said, that he had never treated Anne. He didn't know Anne, but that's what the record says. So he...
And he sent the form, as Skipton required, directly to Skipton.
Yeah.
But that meant that you didn't see what he'd written.
I didn't see what he wrote, no.
And you had concerns about what he might have written.
Yeah.
If we can look at, if you're comfortable with this, look at Anne's death certificate. WITN 0805008, please. We have, towards the, just below halfway, the cause of death is marked as 1A, lower gastrointestinal bleed, 1B, angiodysplasia of the colon, then part 2, end-stage renal failure, diabetes, hepatitis C, carcinoma rectum, and sarcoid liver. Because the death certificate didn't say that liver failure had caused her death, then the application for a stage 2 payment was refused. Is that right?
That's correct.
But you've sought to challenge the death certificate.
Sorry.
You weren't happy with what was put on the death certificate.
No, well, at that point, then I looked at it, because I didn't see. Before that, I didn't observe the death certificate. But at that point, after he said that, what was written on the death certificate wasn't a criteria of what he wanted, I looked at it, and then I saw, no, that is what they have there for the cause of death is not really what happened. And also I said, I write to him, and I told him that it wasn't that like that. She had an operation that caused her death. So he doesn't agree with it. He just doesn't.
And you've sought to, you've made a complaint to the Parliamentary Ombudsman.
Yeah.
But that wasn't upheld. And
well, what they said, they did an investigation, they say. And in paragraphs, they said, one paragraph, they said that they had acknowledged that she had went to the operating theater on the 12th of March. And then further down into another category, they said that Mrs. Anne Jordan Clark sadly died in hospital on the 6th of March. So that caused 2 deaths. She had one on the 12th and one back on the 6th. So they didn't agree with me that, you know, they were not in agreement with me at all. No, they didn't do anything about it.
And I think you've tried to challenge the death certificate because you feel that hepatitis C played a more significant part in your sister's death than we see here, particularly in relation to the gastrointestinal bleed. Is that right?
Yes, the bleeding, I believe that, and they couldn't stop the bleeding in the operating theater. Now, I'm a nurse, and I worked in operating theaters for 30-something years, and I knew when you can't stop the bleeding, the liver is involved. So I challenged that. I told them, no, there's something wrong because they did not do a coroner's report to find out, well, you know, what happened during the operation.
Okay.
So I told Mr. the Skipton Fund that I did not agree with what they were saying, because he was trying to convince me that she died of problems with her intestines. I told him, no, it's not so.
Thank you. We can take that down. Peter, you work as an architect.
I'm a chartered architect, yes.
And during your training in August 1974, you were on a work placement when you had a
Yes,
severe
it's actually I've got that done. It's actually April.
April 1974.
Yeah.
Apologies. You were on a work placement when you had a nosebleed.
That's correct.
That wouldn't stop.
It wouldn't stop, yeah.
And so you were taken to hospital.
I was taken to the North Lonsdale Hospital at A&E.
And what can you tell us about what happened?
I was admitted in A&E. They performed a packing of my nose, and I was left there for a couple of hours, and it seemed to be under control, and I was discharged home later that day. I went home. The bleeding continued, the blood running down the back of my throat. My mother called an ambulance, and I was readmitted, and I was admitted onto the ward, an ENT ward at North Lonsdale Hospital. I was there under the ENT consultant, Mr. Potter, kept in bed, still, not to move, until the blood had stopped. He then took me. I can't recall the exact sequence of events on that particular instance, but I think I was taken down for an investigation, and they determined I had a fibroma of some sort, and felt it would, I think at that time, would subside.
You were diagnosed with a nasopharyngeal angiofibroma, which is a benign tumour.
Yeah, that was. So I went back to college in the September, and the nosebleeds restarted. I was then referred back to the ward, and I was re-examined, and the nasopharyngeal fibroma was determined, the benign tumour.
And you had surgery to remove the tumour?
Yes.
And at that time, you think you received 8 units of blood?
Yes. I'd received blood before and after.
And had you seen that you were receiving blood, or
Yes.
is that a recollection?
When I was admitted to the hospital, because I've been losing so much blood, I can recall them putting the drip in my arm, because I'm very adverse to needles.
In the autumn of 1975, the nosebleeds recurred again.
They did.
And you were referred on that occasion to Birmingham.
Because I was in college in Birmingham, the GP I had in Birmingham referred me to the Steelhouse Lane Hospital in Birmingham, where I saw an ENT consultant there. It so happens my previous ENT consultant had issued me with a letter, which I don't have because it went to the hospital, which had explained in case of a reoccurrence, because apparently these tumours are prone to reoccurrence, that I had been operated on for this procedure. And when I gave this to the consultants, they were sort of overjoyed. They'd never seen this before. So,
and even in Birmingham, this was a very rare
yes,
tumour.
I was advised in Birmingham this was a very rare tumour, 1 in 5 million.
You asked, in fact, to be referred back to North Lonsdale.
I did, so I'll be at home.
And you underwent further surgery.
I was admitted almost immediately, again given more blood prior to the operation, and then underwent second lot of surgery.
And you were then monitored for the next 3 to 4 years.
I was.
And it
yes.
didn't recur.
And it didn't recur, it regressed, yeah.
During that time of being treated in North Lonsdale and Birmingham, what interactions were there with the Christie Hospital?
Well, after every surgical operation by Mr. Potter, he was concerned that because he hadn't been able to retract the whole of the tumour, that it could reoccur. And to try and prevent it reoccurring, he referred me to the Christie Hospital in Manchester for radiotherapy. I went down on after following both operations, and spent a week at the hospital there, undergoing massive amount of X-ray research, and at the end of which they concluded that I'd suffer more damage to my face and scarring and loss of teeth than it was reasonable to expect, and their recommendation was to go back and have further surgery.
Can you tell us what your health was like before the operations?
I was fit. I was very active. You know, I'd go climbing mountains, play squash, and potholing. I was very active. Yeah.
And afterwards?
After the operations. Oh, after the operations were successful, and I returned to normal health, really.
How did you come to find out that you had hepatitis C?
In about 2009, I had my own small architectural practice, and myself and my business partner at the time, we had an insurance policy, a cross-partnership insurance policy to ensure our joint lives, and we were seeking to get better terms. And as part of that, we were both required to have a medical examination. I went to my local GP to have that medical, and he carried out the medical, at the end of which he said, everything's fine, except your liver seems very enlarged. And he says, nothing to worry about. What we do, we'll get referred to a consultant and see what we can find out. Consequent to that, I was referred to Gillian Townsend, a consultant in the Princess Royal Hospital in Telford. I visited her, and I sat there for about an hour. She took a very detailed medical history, asked me lots of detailed questions about my previous health, about the operations I'd had. I then went under MRI scans, ultrasound scans, and lots of blood tests. Following that, one morning a letter arrived at home, and there was a letter from the hospital saying, you've tested positive for HCV. We'd like to have you back for another test just to make sure this is not a false positive. At that time, heaven knows, I didn't know what HCV stood for, so what's the first thing you do? You go and Google HCV, and all this stuff about hepatitis C, so boom, comes up on the screen. Wife was at work, rang her up and saying, I've just had this. I didn't know what to think. Anyway, I went for the second blood test, and then a week or so later I had a phone call at the office from my GP.
They asked you to go straight down.
Can I go straight to his office? Tell the receptionist I phoned you. I went to see him, and he said, you've tested positive for hepatitis C. And he admitted that he did not know a lot about it himself, and that he'd been contacted by the consultant because she was on holiday and was anxious that I should know it straight away.
Take your time.
Anyway, I eventually got back to see Gillian Townsend, and she explained about hepatitis C, and the most likely cause from the history that she had taken was from the blood transfusions I'd had back in 1974 and 1975. I was immediately transferred under the care of a specialist hepatitis C nurse, which they had with Princess Royal, a ladybug. A ladybug named Sandra Taylor, who was absolutely brilliant. And I'm feeling very fortunate to have had her. I didn't realise that a lot of authorities didn't have this facility. And she was totally dedicated to dealing with patients with hepatitis C, whether they be needle stick injuries, drug addicts, or whatever. And she was very good.
You underwent treatment with interferon and ribavirin
I did.
and cleared the hepatitis C.
I've never been told officially that I've cleared. Those words have never been used. And I've discussed this with my wife and said all we can recall being told is that the viral load has managed to go down to such a microscopic level that it's now undetectable.
You've said, though, that you don't feel as physically fit
Now, following the treatment, I can't... my wife would tell you I'm not the same person. I can't do sport. I can't maintain a level of fitness. I used to play a lot of tennis prior to it. I used to play for the club. I used to be a very avid windsurfer. I've tried, it's just not possible. I still suffer from the brain fogs and lack of concentration that occurred during the treatment, and other aspects like my taste has been destroyed. I can't eat food and enjoy food the same way as I used to do. Can't drink tea at all.
And I think you said in your statement that mentally it affected you very severely.
Yeah. Yes, it does. Get depressed, feeling the loneliness.
Thinking about the Skipton Fund, how did you find out about the Skipton Fund?
Well, it was Sandra, really, the hepatitis C nurse. The first time we went to see her and she was explaining about the options we had. I think it's worth saying that one of the first things she said to me is that you're 54, you haven't had any trouble now, but you get to an age where things might start going wrong and you could be dead this time next year, and which is quite a mental blow. But she was very good. She told us about the Skipton Fund. She had the form. She filled the form in the first instance, and she returned the form on my behalf.
But that first application was rejected.
It was rejected on the basis there was no evidence that I'd had an operation or received blood products.
You sought your medical records from the North Lonsdale Hospital, and what was their response?
My first thing I did was I rang Mr. Fish to find out why.
And what were you told?
I was told that they had no evidence. And I said, well, these consultants, they know what they're talking about. So they need physical evidence that I'd had an operation and that I'd had blood products. So, okay. I then went away and approached the North Lonsdale Hospital, which no longer existed. And the subsequent hospital, the Furness District Hospital, when I rang them and spoke to their records department, the first thing they asked me was, "You're not making a claim against us, are you?" Anyway, I subsequently got a letter from them saying there was no records, they'd been destroyed.
The Christie Hospital did provide some information that cross-referred.
They did, yes. And there was limited records from my GP as well.
And at that point, you sought a private consultation with an ENT surgeon.
I submitted, in the first place, I submitted those initial records from the Christie and my GP, which clearly showed that I'd had an operation for a nasopharyngeal fibroma removal. But then that was then subsequently rejected on the basis they accepted that I couldn't demonstrate I'd had any blood products.
So you'd had a simple rejection because nothing had been provided. You then provided what you had, and that was still rejected.
That was still rejected.
So at that point, you decided to appeal.
At that point, I then phoned Mr. Fish again to find out what I had to do, and I managed to get him to admit what you had to do was I had to prove that it was probable that I'd had blood products during these operations. So that's what I set out to do. Can
you tell us, first of all, I think one of the things you did was sort of private ENT appointment.
Unfortunately, the consultant I would approach the consultant who did the operation, but he had died. So I then approached. I got the impression that the medical people looking at my records didn't understand what had happened. So I approached. I paid for a private consultation with an ENT consultant to get an opinion on what he thought would have happened during that operation.
Because from your perspective, the nasopharyngeal angiofibroma was rare, and it appeared that the Skipton Fund hadn't grasped.
That's correct.
How vascular that area was.
Yes. Yeah.
So if we just look at the report produced by your by the private surgeon,
yes.
SKIP 5088, and it's page 52 that I want to start with, please. If we look at the last paragraph of this page, we pick it up 5 lines down. The main treatment for nasopharyngeal angiofibroma involves excision of the lesion and sometimes consideration for radiotherapy. Because of the degree of vascularity of the lesion, present treatment in 2009 would normally include embolization using interventional radiology to achieve a significant reduction in the blood supply to the tumour prior to considering surgery for removal. Despite this, the treatment for this lesion would be highly likely to cause significant bleeding during the surgical procedure. It is noted, however, that this lesion was excised in 1974 and subsequently required further excision at a second operation 12 months later in December 1975. I would therefore expect that no radiological procedure would have been undertaken to specifically reduce the vascularity of this lesion in 1974 or 1975, and therefore one would expect considerable bleeding at the time of surgery, both in 1974 and in 1975. It would therefore seem very highly probable indeed that you would have required at least one or more blood transfusions at or around the time of both of these operations. And then if we carry on to page 56, which is the second part of the letter, you are yourself aware of blood transfusions that occurred at this time. Equally, you are also aware that considerable operative measures were taken to reduce bleeding in this period, and this included packing of the nasal fossa anteriorly and also packing the nasal fossa and nasopharynx posteriorly. You're aware that after the main operation in 1974 and in 1975, that he subsequently required a general anaesthetic for removal of the packing some 2 to 3 days following the main operation. These packs were specifically inserted to reduce the post-operative bleeding, which would have been very highly likely. So you'd paid privately for this report.
I did.
And provided that within your appeal. You also obtained statements from your family members.
I did.
Dealing with their recollections of you receiving
yes.
blood. And when
I just noticed at the end of in the last paragraph, it
yes.
Says treatment of such a tumour in 1974 would almost certainly have required blood transfusion at some stage. So that again is you didn't draw attention to that.
Apologies, sir. You're absolutely right. There is that reference. When you appealed, you provided all of that and lots of articles about the condition, running to about 72 pages.
I did. I would have provided more if I could have access to the medical websites, which I couldn't get access to.
And
I was determined, if I was going to go back, I was going to prove that I had blood products.
And just to give a flavour of what you provided to the appeal panel, if we could turn to page 24 of this document, please, Lawrence. We have a note here of the information as previously submitted. We'll just go down. And we have the bullet points. The Skipton Fund application form duly completed by me and the medical team at the Princess Royal Hospital, overseeing my hepatitis C treatment, a letter from my consultant and hepatitis C screening nurse confirming their investigations on my behalf and that in their opinion there are no other risk factors evident which would have led to me being infected by the hepatitis C virus. A copy of a letter from University Hospitals of Morecambe Bay which confirms that the records of my operations carried out at North Lonsdale Hospital have been destroyed. A copy of a letter from my current GP which confirms that from the records available to him and to the best of his knowledge I've not had any other surgical procedures since the above dates, and then a note of the correspondence. So that's what you'd previously submitted.
Yes, yeah.
If we turn the page, we have the additional information supplied in support of the appeal. A copy of my medical records from the Christie Hospital, Manchester, together with some of the correspondence. A medical opinion provided by Mr. Derek Skinner, consultant ENT surgeon, as to the high probability for the need of blood when surgically removing a nasopharyngeal angiofibroma. A copy of a letter from my mother and father confirming that I had a blood transfusion during my operations. A copy of a letter from my brother confirming that I had a blood transfusion during my operations. And a copy of a letter from your other brother confirming...
There's another brother who's younger, couldn't remember.
A copy of the following articles I've managed to obtain from research on the internet, on which I've highlighted the references to the blood loss and the need for blood transfusions during surgery for the removal of this type of tumour, and you've provided them with 6 medical articles, including a note on Medline Plus about juvenile angiofibroma. And Medline Plus, of course, is the web-based provision that all doctors can access. Having compiled the 72 odd pages, you provided that to Skipton,
Yeah.
and you were successful in your appeal.
I was.
We'll come after the break to discuss the sort of impact that process has had on you and various other thematic discussions that we will have after lunch. But I note the time, sir, and I wonder if it's a good time to break for lunch before we pick up those themes.
Yes, it is. So we'll start again this afternoon at 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.